Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Jamie Goodhall, and I am an adjunct instructor at Southern New Hampshire University, and I am coming to you from Alexandria, Virginia. So today I thought we would talk about Pirates of the Golden Age and sort of this fact versus fiction, given how much myth there is regarding piracy. And I always like to start at the beginning of when we really start to see pirates come to life. And so when we think about pirates, we do tend to think about those swashbucklers of the so-called Golden Age. And that's in the 17th and 18th centuries. But really, pirates have existed essentially for as long as people have roamed the world's waters. In fact, the word pirate comes from the ancient Greek word paromai, which essentially just means attempt. And in this context, it means the attempt to steal. It then, of course, evolved into Latin and Greek, and that is where we get the anglicized version of pirate. The earliest recorded instances we have of piracy are around the 14th century BCE, and that is occurring in the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. And part of the reason that piracy develops as early as it does in this particular region is due to its geography. The geography of this region sort of limited agricultural production along the coastlines. And so those who did live along the coastlines tended to turn towards maritime trades. We're talking fishing and gathering salt and seaweed and any other sort of sustenance that would help them maintain their lives. Now, ships in the 14th century BCE are not sailing very long distances over open water. So shipping at that time was pretty much limited to a few navigable routes, mostly pretty close to the coastline. And this is essentially very beneficial for maritime raiders who are able to use the ruggedness of that coastline and the numerous inlets and islets that are lining the coastline, and they're able to hide from those who are shipping goods from one place to another. This means, of course, that unfortunately for those merchants, it is entirely too late for them to escape by the time they notice that a maritime raider has spotted them. One record we have of this is an inscription from the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III, which essentially just details his establishment of defenses along the Nile Delta against these commerce raiders. And if we go to a mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, there are accounts, numerous accounts of Egypt's battle with the so-called Sea Peoples. And this is a loose confederation of what we would call pirates that operated between the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Now, it wouldn't be until the rise of the Roman Empire that we sort of see a successful concerted effort to eradicate piracy. For example, when the pirates sacked the Roman town of Ostia in 67 BCE, a new law was issued which essentially authorized the Roman general Pompey the Great to use whatever means necessary to deal with this so-called scourge. And, it worked. It was pretty effective in that region. But pirates, of course, were not entirely eradicated. And we'll see that pirates sort of pop up from time to time. We even see them today. And so we know their successors have navigated the seas for at least the last 2,000 years. Now, one of the more interesting things to think about is how do we know what we know about pirates? And part of that is because there is a lack of texts from pirates. And part of that is due to the fact of their very nature, which is plausible deniability, very important in their line of work. You don't want to openly admit in writing that you are a pirate because it is illegal. The other issue is that we just have missing records. There's a lot of natural disasters that are occurring throughout the Atlantic world, particularly on the Caribbean islands, where a lot of these pirates would spend their time. And so letters from governors and other officials might not have made it to London, which means that they wouldn't be in the records we have available. Now, we do have a number of pirate trial transcripts, but we have to keep in mind with those that you're dealing with people who have been caught and are being tried for the act of piracy. Most people are going to be intent on saving themselves. And so there's a lot of professions of innocence and, pirates made me do this. I didn't have any choice. So you have to kind of read between the lines with these trial transcripts. And of course, you also have to remember that it's not like trial transcripts today where you've got somebody who's able to type. This is all handwritten and recorded. And so how much of the material is 100% accurate? Difficult to say. And it's also coming from the government perspective, which is the other set of documents that we tend to have access to, which are official government accounts. These are letters from royal governors or colonial officials, members of the harbor duty, and they are essentially writing to the Board of Trade and Plantations or any other sort of higher official about their experiences with pirates. Now, colonial governors, of course, are going to try to assert that they had nothing to do with piracy, that they were actively trying to rid their region of piracy. But we know that that is not necessarily the case for a lot of them. And so again, it's reading between the lines. And the last sort of major source that we have is a book by a man named Captain Charles Johnson. That is a pseudonym as far as we can tell. Some have said that this was Daniel Defoe. I have not found enough concrete evidence to make that assertion, but we do know that this Charles Johnson was a contemporary because a general history of the pirates was published in 1724. And so it's likely that he heard a lot of the stories from people who had encountered pirates, merchants who had suffered losses from pirates, as well as perhaps meeting certain pirates in a tavern or something similar. But we also know that a large amount of what he writes in this book is essentially made up. Now, the people might be real. We have the ability to corroborate the identities of some of these people, but there's no way for him to have known conversations that were happening on board the ship or the origins of a lot of these people, because we just don't have that information. So it's an interesting source to peruse if you're interested in piracy. Lots of great storytelling, but it is sort of just that, a story. Now, we know, as I mentioned, that contemporaries were very interested in the lives of pirates. There was such a fascination with these, villains of all nations, as they were often referred to. And we're going to see how not everybody agreed with that particular sentiment. And we can kind of see this because this book by Captain Charles Johnson was a bestseller in his day. And as far as I'm aware, it was published in multiple languages and sold many, many copies, which is rare for that particular time period. I think at that time, the only other bestseller was the Bible, which, makes sense. And we know that official cooperation, we're talking explicit support of piracy, has its foundations early, but we see this play out in the Atlantic quite prominently with the so-called sea dogs, who were technically privateers, and we'll get into the difference between a pirate and a privateer in a minute. But they were supported by Queen Elizabeth I. They were often known as Elizabeth's sea dogs. And of course, it was the Spanish who gave them that moniker, the sea dogs. They didn't necessarily refer to themselves that way. Now, being commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I, this meant that their role was to augment the naval English presence at that time. And they helped to play sort of a major developmental role in the exploration and establishment of the English Atlantic. Now, their number one target at that time was the Spanish. This was because at that point in the 1500s, Spain had gotten a very large head start in the colonization process compared to England. And so the English are desperately trying to catch up, not just in terms of acquiring land and resources, but also financially. And so, the Spanish have a really strong armada, which is their navy, but the English Navy at that time, the Royal Navy, not quite as developed as it will come to be later when it becomes known as the greatest navy in the world. Now, operating as privateers under the authority of the Queen gave them a bit of license to wiggle around the law, if you will. And so anyone with a thirst for pillaging Spanish towns or ships, and who had their own ship at their disposal, this is what makes them privateers, they could then seek that commission from Queen Elizabeth I and get sponsorship from investors, companies, shareholders, with the intent on preying on Spanish shipping. At this point, though, we tend to have this idea of pirates as sort of the lower rungs of society. They are, men hard on their luck, but the privateers, the sea dogs at this time, really are from the higher levels of society. We have Sirs Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, Walter Raleigh, and numerous other prominent individuals. And so they tended to be either born into or raised as nobility. And what's really interesting is that having this particular kind of background and their connections to the maritime world enabled them to sort of foster an appreciation for the act of plundering on the high seas. And this came to be known as discriminating piracy. And it was the Spanish, of course, who pushed for stronger eradication of piracy at the time, because, of course, the Spanish are the ones suffering the most. Now, a pirate, on the other hand, was considered, even by the English, to be a scourge of the seas. They, again, were villains of all nations. And there's really only two things that separate a privateer from a pirate. It does get a lot more complex than that, but we're going to simplify it a bit. And that is your perspective and whether or not you have a letter of marque or a commission. Now, a letter of marque, which is typically issued from the crown, but could later be issued by colonial governors and other officials, essentially made the plundering of foreign nations, particularly enemy nations, legal under the law, and in this case, under English law. Now, the Spanish, of course, saw it very differently, and this is where perspective comes in. So you are the Spanish, and you have your ship plundered by the English, and they claim they have the legal authority to do so. You, as Spain, do not recognize the legitimacy of this letter of marque or this commission because it's not part or from your government. And so there's a lot of political wrangling that we see happening behind the scenes during this particular time period. And sort of what's interesting in the case of the English, as far as pirating and privateering go, is that a letter of marque wasn't always required in the beginning. Attempts to regulate piracy in the Elizabethan era especially were kind of half-hearted at best. So long as they're attacking foreign ships, particularly the Spanish, the crown tended to overlook a missing letter of marque or commission. Sometimes they would issue them later and it would be retroactively applied. Now, although local officials were tasked with policing piracy as opposed to privateering, they regularly released suspected pirates or simply failed to apprehend them to begin with. In the eyes of many English men and women, the sea dogs in particular were really doing the duty of serving their country. This was a patriotic duty. They were promoting the Protestant religion. They were supporting the development of the English Atlantic economy, and they were supplementing that burgeoning Royal Navy. Of course, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese are dealing with this very differently. Uh, and if you were a privateer under Queen Elizabeth I and you were captured by the Spanish, you were often treated as a pirate in Spanish courts, and you had to hope that Queen Elizabeth moved very quickly to get you freed, because otherwise you would be hanged as a pirate in the Spanish courts. Now, one of the things that makes differentiating piracy and privateering very difficult, at least in terms of the courts, is that privateers would often attack what we would consider neutral vessels. Again, they're supposed to be attacking enemy shipping, but if you're not at war with a nation and one of your privateers sacks that ship, how do you handle that? Now, making a profit as a privateer was not guaranteed. And this is sort of going along with piracy in that on a privateering vessel, the only way you would get paid typically was to operate on a system of prey for pay. What this means is that you're not getting paid a wage to work on this ship. You instead receive a portion of the goods that you plundered during your operations. Now, this system, of course, incentivized the seizure of any ship, regardless of enmity. But as long as they shied away from the English ships, Queen Elizabeth tended to figure out a way to make the system work for them. Now, one prominent instance we have of this sort of playing out in the interest of the nation was Thomas White's 1560 venture on the former Barbary coast of North Africa. He ignores his sponsor's directives, which basically had him focusing primarily on the transatlantic trade of enslaved peoples. And instead, he decided he was going to seize two Spanish treasure ships carrying silver from the South American colonies of Spain back to Europe. Now, this, of course, was seen as incredibly profitable. So the temptation wasn't, entirely too great for Thomas White. But then when he is brought to court on accusations of piracy, the authorities in London decided that this was very profitable for them as well. And they decided to overlook the fact that Thomas White did not have a commission or a letter of marque. And they allowed both White's investors and the English government, who were both entitled to a share of the booty, to benefit from what essentially was White's rogue decision. Spanish, not very happy with this decision, but it sort of demonstrates how the English are using piracy and the guise of privateering to their advantage. Now, piracy in and of itself is very important to the early growth of these colonial Atlantic colonies, especially the port cities where trade is occurring. And pirates, we know, would not have been able to play a role in this particular activity if it had not been for the cooperation, whether that was official or implicit, between the many different types of people, colonial leaders, prominent merchants, all engaging in some way with the pirates to make this work. Now, it was the job of colonial governors to essentially try to facilitate a balance between the desires of the nation and what the crown wanted versus what was best for the inhabitants of that colony. Now, of course, they also wanted to take care of themselves. And at that time, being a colonial governor did not pay quite that well. And so complicity with pirates helped many of these colonial governors sort of fulfill these duties, this balance, at least in their mind. That's the, spiel they went with. And so local leadership and merchants are supporting the development of these illicit economies, essentially, what I like to call economies of opportunity. And this helps them to foster pretty quick economic development. And of course, they are also ardent participants in the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans, even pirates, although they do have a reputation for being very democratic. many pirates had no problem participating in this barbaric trade. So now, of course, this facilitates development of certain ports to the detriment of others, but we will see sort of how this all works out, particularly for the English. Now, one of the more interesting things that's occurring, as we shift through the 16th into the 17th century is sort of how the relationship between pirates transferred from that crown authority, so, the support of Queen Elizabeth, to that support specifically from colonial officials. And this sort of helps to normalize piracy among this lower population, as opposed, of course, to the sea dogs who had been on those higher rungs of society. Now, again, this resulted in sort of a very robust informal network that helped to sort of sustain island economies, especially during periods of incessant warfare. Now, during times of war, the empire, particularly the English, were very bad at securing their colonies because they were preoccupied either with Europe or, these naval battles, if you will. So this failure of imperial leadership led a lot of colonial leaders to turn towards pirates for things like security or for sustaining their economies while shipping was so dangerous, and a lot of merchants opted just not to ship during that time period. One man's smuggler or pirate was essentially another man's legitimate merchant during this time period. And so by tolerating errant privateers or these pirates, allowing them to fence their goods in their colonies, allowing the smugglers to evade legitimate markets, and often trading contraband with nations who may or may not have been at war with. This not only increased their own capital as colonial leaders, but it facilitated the creation of these alternative networks, and sort of gave it a semi-legitimate standing in colonial society. And this often transcended class hierarchies, which is really interesting. If you look at, for example, taverns and coffee houses in the colonies, you'll see that there's a lot of intermingling between social classes that's facilitated by this exchange with piracy that you don't quite see in other areas. Now, the illicit connections that are being developed help to provide sort of an alternative to this traditional mercantile network. And of course, this means that unlike traditional networks, which record everything from names of the individuals on ships, the bills of lading, payment of taxes and duties, all those sort of official things, if you are participating in illicit trade, you can circumvent those records. And so not only are you skirting the law, this meant you are abandoning the ability to trace you through the paperwork. Very helpful for pirates, especially helpful too for governors who would outfit ships specifically for the purpose of trading with pirates. This meant that it was very difficult at this point to bring evidence against anyone who was participating in these economies of opportunity. Now, we of course know that these networks fostered between these different groups helped to facilitate growth, but they were also detrimental in many ways. Again, we have this notion of pirates as sort of Robin Hood-esque figures who, robbed from these, terrible, wealthy merchants, and they were just trying to undermine this authority and help the people. In reality, they're very self-serving, and so this could be very problematic. Edward Mansfeldt's invasion of Granada and Campeche in 1663, which was quietly supported by Jamaican officials, was one such instance in which the devastation was immense. Now, bringing money, commodities, protection, and enslaved people to these islands and to these colonies, this sort of filled the gaps left by endemic warfare and its consequences. But it doesn't help to explain why individuals would turn to piracy as opposed to more legitimate sources of financial gain. Now, the life of a pirate very different from person to person, let's say. And there are many different ways of becoming a pirate. Some of them are bored merchants in the midst of a midlife crisis, like Stede Bonnet, who just really desperately wanted adventure. Stede Bonnet left his family, bought a ship, hired a crew. Terrible idea for becoming a pirate. Don't hire your crew. They expect you to continue paying them. Some of them are pirate hunters turned pirate, like Captain William Kidd. But for the most part, we're dealing with fairly average individuals. They are sailors, they're merchants, they are fathers, sons, they might have wives and families. And they, some of them have worked in maritime trades and found themselves hard on their luck. Others were on, say, a merchant vessel or a Royal Navy vessel and part of a mutiny. Others were forced into piracy by pirates who had attacked their ship. So, again, there's lots of different ways to become a pirate. These men are doing all the things that men at the time do. They're drinking in taverns, they're investing in businesses, they're using their loot to buy homes and invest in property. And they are supporting their families and loved ones. Now, if you were part of this group, especially during the latter part of the Golden Age, you might become part of what was then known as the Brethren of the Coast, which was essentially just a loose coalition of pirates and sometimes privateers who operated with bases in Tortuga, Nassau, and Port Royal. And this brotherhood, this is where we get that sort of democratic egalitarian idea about pirates, in that this brotherhood promoted the idea of a pirate's code, which was a set of agreements among those on board the ship. And it dealt with everything from the division of loot, where to sail, when to stop, who to attack, etc. And in a lot of cases, a captain was only captain in name and would only be captain during times of battle or attack, just because you needed somebody at the helm kind of directing everyone. But other than that, for a lot of these groups, everyone was equal. Now, we do know, of course, some of the more infamous pirate captains like Blackbeard, he was captain, and he sort of fits that stereotype of, the ruthless leader. But these people are sharing equal votes. They are considering themselves, part of this system of undermining authority. But not all pirates at that time are actually part of this brotherhood. The old adage, there's no honor among thieves. And the idea is that, while you might not steal from someone on your own ship, because that would be a problem, there wasn't much to stop you from stealing from other pirates. And sometimes, you needed a new ship. And so you would attack a pirate who had a perfectly good ship, and you would take it along with everything that was on board. Captain Culliford, for example, stole Captain Kidd's boat at one point. And Walter Kennedy actually stole a ship from Black Bart Roberts, which I don't know how he did that, but kudos, because that's pretty impressive. But not all of the pirates were men. And while we have very little concrete evidence to support the notion that women were pirates, we do have the most famous women, Bonny and Mary Read. Now, we can sort of ascertain that there were other women who participated in piracy, but they would have disguised themselves as men. And the fact that we don't know many pirates' names, period, would mean that it's very easy to miss them if they are in the records. Now, most of what we know about Anne Bonny and Mary Read comes from the Captain Charles Johnson book, A General History of Pirates. According to Johnson, Anne Bonny was born in Kinsale, County Cork in Ireland. And this was probably around 1698. And her father was an attorney named William Cormac. And her mother was the family maid. So her father had an affair with the maid named Mary Brennan. When Mary gave birth to Anne, over time, William grew so fond of this child that he arranged for her to live with him. But you got to avoid scandal, right? And so he dressed Anne as a boy and introduced her as the child of a family relative who was entrusted to his care. So didn't claim her as his child, but regardless, he did care for her. Now, when Anne's gender and true parentage became known throughout the region, William, Mary, and Anne decided to emigrate to Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Mary dies in 1711, at which point Anne was quite rebellious, and she was in her teen years, so very much a teenage girl. She began exhibiting what was known to be a fierce and courageous temper. Now, her father disowns her in 1718 when she marries a poor sailor by the name of James Bonny. Anne and James sail to New Providence, which is now Nassau, in the Bahamas. And this is where James Bonny is alleged to have become an informant, where he would turn in pirates to Governor Woodes Rogers, who is infamously known as a anti-pirate, hunter. Anne, however, is spending most of her time at local taverns and other similar establishments. And at this point, Anne is feeling abandoned by her husband. She is upset with his role as an informant. She's very enamored with the pirate lifestyle. And she reportedly falls in love with one pirate in particular named John Rackham, also known as Calico Jack. And so she ultimately leaves her husband to join Rackham's crew. Now, accounts vary pretty much as to how Anne met Mary Read, but according to Johnson, Rackham's ship actually conquered Mary somewhere in the West Indies, and that Mary was among those taken prisoner and sort of conscripted into duty. Now, after this, Anne, who was dressed in female attire, tried to seduce this handsome new recruit because at that point, Mary was presenting herself as a man. Now, Mary, she reveals to Anne that she is actually a woman. And so Anne vows to keep Mary's secret just because she's not sure how the rest of the crew will take that information. So the women became really close friends. They are confidants, and depending on what source you're looking into, some people claim that they may or may not have been lovers. But really, they have a lot in common. Mary was also an illegitimate child. Now, as these two women are commiserating essentially about their lives, Rackham is becoming incredibly jealous of Anne's relationship with Mary. One day he bursts into her cabin with the intention of slitting her throat, according to Johnson. But upon learning her true identity, Rackham agrees to keep Mary's secret from the rest of the crew and continued to treat her as an equal. Now, during battles, Anne and Mary were alleged to have fought side by side every time. But of course, all good things must come to an end. Most pirate lives were short. Most pirate stints were very short. And in October of 1720, Rackham and his crew are captured by Captain Jonathan Barnett. Now, Anne and Mary initially refused to surrender, and they remained on deck. They are fighting this captain's men all on their own, and they are firing their pistols, swinging cutlasses. They are doing everything they can to maintain their hold before they're overpowered. Now, both women were found guilty and sentenced to hang, along with the rest of Rackham's crew, of course. But for Anne and Mary, they were allowed a stay of execution because it was alleged that they were both pregnant. They both pled their belly, as it were. Mary, according to records, died of a violent fever in prison. This may or may not have been during childbirth, but her April 1721 burial is in the records of a St. Catherine's Church in Jamaica. Now, there's no real record of what happened to Anne. A ledger does list the burial of an Anne Bonny on 29 December 1733. It's in the same town in Jamaica where she was tried, but some have speculated that her father, actually having heard the sentence bestowed upon her, decided he would step in. And as a man of prominent stature, he was able to allegedly have her conviction overturned and bring her back with him to South Carolina, where she would have died in April of 1782. So it's not really clear. Is she the Anne Bonny who was buried in 1733? Is she the Anne Bonny who was listed in Charleston in 1782? Your guess is as good as anyone's, but needless to say, neither of them were hanged by the government. So I feel like that's a win. Now, pirates, men or women, were very interesting individuals. And this is a quote here by the French historian Hubert Deschamps. And basically, he says that pirates are this unique race born of the sea. He refers to them as free people detached from other human societies. They have no future, all of that stuff. And again, that sort of fits with our stereotype of pirates, the idea of these single men out for adventure, right? But the reality is that this is not true for probably the majority of pirates. And that is because despite his description, there's copious evidence out there that proves many pirates were married or had strong family ties and connections to the landed community. Some pirates were educated to a degree. Others may have come from families who enjoyed high status in their respective societies, like Stede Bonnet. There are also men like the Griffin brothers, William and Benjamin, and their colleague Daniel Smith, who were all part of Henry Avery's crew. Those three individuals used their pirate loot to buy a significant amount of property in Bermuda in 1696. They even got Smith's father to help them rent out their properties, sort of seeing land as an investment, right? So they were able to continue to make money, having retired from this pirate lifestyle. But this, sort of highlights the fact that the socioeconomic realities of many pirates is that they had people to care for, not just themselves. And so for them, piracy could be a means of providing for that family or those loved ones when legitimate employment was either difficult or impossible to come by. And in time, most of these people returned to their families. Most pirates are doing 1 or 2 ventures. The turnover of a pirate crew is very high. So while it is a deadly lifestyle, it is also a relatively short one in terms of career, right? You don't want to spend your entire life as a pirate because it's also very difficult. Now, Alexander Esquemeling, who was a former buccaneer and penned the work History of the Buccaneers of America, alleged that many of these pirates created plantations, they grew tobacco, set up taverns, and basically used piracy as a way to launch other careers. Now, pirate communities had this highly organized social structure, right? If we think back to the pirate codes. And what's really interesting is that these social structures were designed in a way to support and maintain their connections with their loved ones on land. Now, it was not uncommon for a pirate to personally return the belongings of a deceased pirate to his family. Sometimes this happened as a result of what is called matelatage, in which 2 pirates would form a civil union of sorts. For the most part, they were considered economic unions where they would fight with each other, against the enemy. They would share their loot. They would, create these systems in which they would vow to take care of each other. Now, Esquemeling again records a bit of this when he says that if a pirate were to live longer than his comrade, quote, the survivor is bound to give part to the dead man's friends or to his wife if he was married. Now, many pirates, like other sailors, used that matelotage again, but although it's typically considered an economic relationship, we do have evidence that this sometimes crossed into romantic relationships. There's no evidence really to say one way or another within those records what that matelotage agreement meant for that particular couple. But, it is very difficult to discern. Now, I mentioned Daphne Palmer Giannakopoulos, and she came across this really fascinating situation in which some pirates created a mail system that would allow them to keep in touch with their loved ones. In 1699, the pirate captain Samuel Burgess's ship, the Margaret, was seized, and in its sea chest were over 200 documents, many of which were essentially letters between pirates and their loved ones. And so this helps to sort of dispel this notion that pirates were illiterate, social isolates with no future, right? One of the more famous sort of pirate families would be Captain and Sarah Kidd. Now, Sarah Bradley Cox Ort Kidd was the wife of Captain William Kidd, and there's a lot of shenanigans going on with Miss Kidd here, but her first husband, William Cox, drowned after just 4 years of wedded bliss. And she inherited a fortune from Cox before she remarried. And then she married a man named John Ort, who died mysteriously just days before she filed for a marriage license to wed William Kidd in 1691. Now, this allowed Kidd to make use of Sarah's fortune, acquire a ship, become this pirate hunter, which then allowed him to become a pirate himself. This is a depiction of what would be Kidd's house on Pearl Street in New York City. And this was a very nice house, well stocked with wine, trinkets, all the things that displayed status in society. And the couple even owned a pew at Trinity Church. So here's a pirate owning a pew in a church. I find that very fascinating. Unfortunately, William comes under suspicion of piracy after being with Sarah only 8 years. And of course, she is believed to have assisted him. Now, there's a lot of ins and outs as far as legality goes, but ultimately, Kidd is tried and convicted, and he is ultimately executed in May of 1701. Sarah is spared the news. She is eventually cleared of all charges. Her belongings are eventually returned to her. And in 1703, she remarries, and the two live quietly with her children until her husband dies, at which point she opens a tavern, perfectly appropriate, which she operated until her death in 1744. Perhaps less likely to be a family man, although alleged to have married 14 some odd women, is the infamous Blackbeard the pirate. Edward Thatch, or Teach, also known as Blackbeard, has a relatively mysterious past. Some people think he may have gotten his start in the Royal Navy or as a privateer during Queen Anne's War. But we do know that in 1715, when a fleet of Spanish ships were wrecked on the coast of Florida in the Atlantic, that Blackbeard sort of jumps at the chance to become a pirate or a shipwreck diver, if you will. Now, Blackbeard is kind of in and out of the records. He develops this very notorious reputation. He's alleged to have, smoke coming from his beard, very menacing. One of my favorite stories about Blackbeard is when he is blockading the port of Charleston, South Carolina. He blocks this port for nearly a week, seizing lots of vessels coming in and out. But my favorite is when they detain passengers of one of the ships and held them hostage. You would think, like, why not just get money, steal the stuff, and move on? Well, it turns out that most of Blackbeard's crew was sick and dying. A lot of transmitted diseases happening to his crew, and he decides, you know what, I need some medicine, and the only way I'm going to get that medicine is to ransom these hostages for that chest of medicine. Of course, the governor's like, absolutely, here you go, please let them go, whatever you want. Well, Blackbeard is good on his word in that he does return the individuals back to shore, but he has a reputation to maintain. And so to humiliate them, he sends them rowing themselves back to shore, quote, practically naked. I mean, that's probably pretty embarrassing for high society people at that time. But his career, of course, like so many of his colleagues, comes to a very brutal, short-lived end. So Blackbeard is being chased by a Lieutenant Robert Maynard. And basically, this is a battle that ensues between the two and their crews. It does not fare well for Blackbeard. It is said that he was shot at least 5 times, cut over 20, and that it wasn't until he was beheaded that Blackbeard finally died. Now, according to legend, the men kept Blackbeard's head as proof of his death, but tossed his body overboard. And according to this legend, Blackbeard's body swam around the ship 3 times, headless. And then they used Blackbeard's head later on a pike to warn other pirates who were coming in. And then the legend goes that somebody stole Blackbeard's skull, gilded it, turned it into a cup, and nobody knows where it is now. But swimming headless bodies and skulls for cups, I feel like, is a perfectly appropriate ending for Blackbeard. Now, the last thing I want to talk about very briefly, and this is something that we could cover in more detail at another time, but is the concept of the role of pirates in the transatlantic trade of enslaved peoples. Now, pirates are very much a part of this traditional triangle trade where you see goods going from Europe to Africa in exchange for enslaved Africans that would then be trafficked forcibly to the so-called New World, and then the New World raw materials back to Europe. Now, one of the instances we have of how this sort of plays out is that Captain John Powell of the ship the Hopewell in 1617 was granted a commission from the Somers Island Company of Bermuda to seize any slave vessels that they came across. And in this instance, they seized a Portuguese vessel containing a very large number of enslaved Africans and took them to the English colony of Bermuda as opposed to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. Now, this, of course, was illegal because at that time, the English and the Portuguese were not at war. But by the early 17th century, captured slave vessels and the enslaved people on them began to arrive regularly to locations like Bermuda and Barbados. And a lot of those came at the hands of pirates. Now, this is, supported primarily by merchants and even political officials who would use pirates to circumvent these imperial monopolies. Now, at this point, the English are relying on their own Royal African Company. But for a lot of merchants and officials, this was a very costly process. And so they could get enslaved Africans cheaper from pirates. Again, totally barbaric trade, but pirates were more than happy to treat these enslaved Africans as commodities as opposed to humans. Now, by the mid 1700s, English piracy had really shifted its geographical focus from the Atlantic world to the Indian Ocean. And this is where we see some of the most successful pirates of the age: Henry Avery, Thomas Tew, even Captain Kidd. This is where they're using St. Mary's Island and Madagascar as their hideout. And this is really a great sort of demonstration of this framework called the Indo-Atlantic, which is this sort of connection between these two. And Kevin McDonald covers the Indo-Atlantic in some of his work. And at this point, I think we should close. And I am very grateful for all of you for tuning into this lecture.